Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're going to tackle a question that I think a lot of us have wrestled with. How in the world we make sense of the Old Testament prophets? How do we find a clear, Christ-centered framework to understand what's going on?
You know, if you've ever tried to read Isaiah or Jeremiah straight through and just felt completely lost, well, you are in very good company. Even the great reformer Martin Luther felt that way.
He said they have a queer way of talking, that they just ramble from one thing to the next, and you just can't make head or tail of them. It feels disjointed, right? Almost chaotic. So the question is, how do we make sense of it all?
Well, the key, the thing that unlocks everything, is realizing they aren't just rambling. Not at all. They're following a plan, a divine blueprint.
Yep, they're operating from a divine blueprint, a kind of architectural plan for all of God's redemptive history. And the key to reading that blueprint is covenant theology.
Okay, so let's dive into this. The master key here, which is just so central to Reformed thinking, is covenant theology. And it's really the idea that God relates to us and guides all of history through a series of covenants, these binding relational promises.
Literally every warning, every promise, every single oracle you read from the prophets is rooted in the logic of these covenants. So, to get a handle on the blueprint, we've got to start with the foundation. And right at its core, there's this powerful, driving theological tension.
See, on one hand, you've got the conditional Mosaic covenant. You can think of this like the building code. If Israel obeyed, they'd be blessed. But if they violated it, they'd get the curses, judgment, exile. Simple as that. Their fate was tied to their obedience. But then, on the other hand, you have the unconditional Abrahamic and Davidic covenants. These are like the architect's non-negotiable guarantees. A people, a land, an eternal king, all based entirely on God's faithfulness, not Israel's.
And this tension creates this recurring rhythm, this logical flow you see over and over and over in the prophets. It follows this three-step pattern. First, there's judgment for breaking the conditional covenant. That judgment then leads to a call for repentance, which is always rooted in God's mercy. And that call ultimately points to a future salvation, which is guaranteed by God's unconditional promises. Judgment, repentance, salvation. You'll see it everywhere.
This covenant logic is the very skeleton of the prophetic message. So let's take a closer look at that first step, judgment. The famous oracles of judgment, all those warnings and woes, they basically function like a divine inspection report. They detail exactly how Israel violated the terms of the Mosaic covenant. And the prophets just hammer away at two main categories of sin. First was idolatry, running after other gods, which fractured their unique relationship with Yahweh. And second, which always follows the first, was social injustice. Their idol worship inevitably created a rotten, exploitative social system.
And we're not talking about abstract ideas here. Oh no. The prophets called out specific, systemic corruption. The elite gobbling up land, judges taking bribes, leaders conspiring against the weak, and people showing up for empty religious festivals while completely ignoring justice. It got so bad the prophet Micah basically accused them of cannibalizing the poor.
Isaiah just captures the heartbreak of it all with this incredible, devastating wordplay in Hebrew. God looked for justice, mishpat, but all he found was bloodshed, mishpach. He looked for righteousness, tzedakah, but all he heard were the cries of the oppressed, se'akah. By all accounts, the nation was a failed project.
So, with an inspection report that bad, why wasn't the whole project just scrapped? Demolished? Well, it's because of the blueprint's irrevocable warranty.
And this is absolutely crucial. The oracles of hope, the promises of future restoration and salvation, they weren't based on Israel's ability to somehow get their act together. No way. They were rooted entirely, completely in God's faithfulness to his unbreakable, unconditional promises to Abraham and to David.
It really boils down to this. Judgment was the direct result of Israel's infidelity to their conditional covenant. But salvation was the guaranteed outcome of God's faithfulness to his unconditional covenants. And in the end, God's faithfulness, not Israel's unfaithfulness, was always going to have the final word.
This is the theological engine that drives the entire Old Testament, and it points relentlessly, powerfully, in one direction, toward the master architect himself, the one who comes to perfectly fulfill the entire plan.
You see, the entire prophetic blueprint finds its climax in the person and work of Jesus Christ. For instance, that mysterious suffering servant in Isaiah, the one who gives his life as an offering for sin and is then raised from the grave,
Well, that finds its ultimate, perfect fulfillment in the substitutionary death and resurrection of Jesus.
And remember that unconditional promise to David for a king who would reign forever? Isaiah prophesied that a child would be born, and he'd be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, and he would reign on David's throne forever. Of course, this is none other than Jesus, the Messiah, the true and final king.
So you can see this grand, unfolding plan stretching across all of history. The Old Testament prophets lay out the blueprint, foretelling a suffering servant, a new covenant, a righteous king. Then comes Jesus Christ, the fulfillment, who perfectly embodies all those roles and secures our salvation. And now we look forward to the final consummation, the new heavens and new earth, where his kingdom is finally and fully established. So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that the prophetic message wasn't just for ancient Israel. It has this timeless, ongoing function for God's people in every single generation. It's meant to sober up the rich and powerful and to console the afflicted and the poor. It's meant to warn the high and comfort the low. It speaks directly to us, today.
And that's not just my take on it. The Apostle Peter tells us flat out. He says it was revealed to the prophets that they weren't serving themselves, they were serving us, the future covenant community. Their words were written down and preserved to guide us, to correct us, to warn us, and to comfort us all the way through history.
Which brings us to one final and I think challenging question. If you look at our world through this divine blueprint, through God's absolute commitment to justice, to righteousness, and to his fierce covenant love, what do you see? If Isaiah or Amos or Micah were speaking to our society today, what injustices would they condemn? What modern idols would they tear down? And ultimately, what hope would they offer? Now that is something to think about.